Hey guys, this is just something I've been chewing on because I don't know. I started listening to songs from Elf, the Broadway musical during the Christmas season, and I've kind of generally been thinking about Elf because of Jon Favreau and the success of The Mandalorian and his work on the Jungle Book. And something that's really interesting to me about Elf is how it follows. Like, this can broadly be said of movies in general, but the way that one specifically reaches for kind of the prodigal son hero's journey in a sense, but it's kind of like a subversion of it because ah in a prodigal son story generally it would be about the child leaving home and going out into the world to learn about the world and essentially take the world unto himself to become a whole human. So, the Pinocchio story, for example. But Elf kind of subverts it because uh, Buddy, the main character, is essentially a human living in the North Pole. So he kind of doesn't fit there, and yet it's all he knows. And in terms of how the story of Elf works, something that intrigues me is um so let me start from I guess the beginning or backtrack a little bit, I guess. Buddy essentially discovers that he's adopted and goes into the human world. I believe it was New York specifically to try and find his family. And he does, and the movie generally charts his journey of bonding with his brother and his father, etc., etc. So he's kind of going out into the world and taking on these like primal human connections. It's kind of like he's redeeming different facets of himself that he's taking unto himself. Like archetypes that a main character encounters when they go out into the world pretty much exist within the main character. And so the story of the main character's journey is generally about uh discovering what's already within them by encountering things that are in the outside world. So there's kind of a neat mythic paradox in there. So he goes out into the human world, he meets his family, he finds love, you know, encountering the feminine, that sort of thing. Basically becoming balanced. And what's interesting to me about it is that in a mythic sense, this kind of places where he comes from as like the highest philosophical good. So for example, another story that might be like Judaism or Christianity. And it's kind of funny to me because of, you know, uh, how, in a sense, kitschy and unusual the trappings of like the Christmas spirit are. Like elves, Santa, all that. I mean, I think it makes sense because Santa is also mythic and very viable. um, I mean, the myth of Santa, the myth of the elves, what he represents, what that world represents. That's like a viable path for creating a myth. Uh, yeah. Anyway, going back to what I was saying before. So in a sense, the values of Santa kind of are like the Christianity of the movie Elf. And Buddy essentially becomes like the harbinger of the highest philosophical good. And by entering the human world, he's able to redeem the people around them and bring them closer to the highest philosophical good. But it's also a situation wherein he's coming down to earth. Like, there's an aspect of him connecting with the body the animal part of humanity by meeting his blood family and finding romance and all that. And something that's so interesting to me about that aspect, at least as like a comparison, it reminds me a lot of the Shawshank Redemption. The Shawshank Redemption essentially involves the main character, Andy Dufresne, wrongly getting sent to prison, and then once he's there, with his innocence and intellect, he's able to redeem the people around him and reveal their innocence. Um, so it's different because there isn't like strictly a matter of him needing to be brought closer to his visceral humanity. I mean, eh, you can maybe make an argument about that. Obviously, these stories always go through like a death rebirth cycle, so like naturally he becomes whole in some sense by going into the dark underworld of the prison and then leaving it in like an Orpheus sort of manner, but it is different. Uh it's kind of like the positive antecedent to Stephen King's It, because he pretty much wrote both. Um except Shawshank Redemption happens from the perspective of the good Pennywise, that being Andy Dufresne, and he's helping instead of hurting. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, I guess you could say like Pennywise, in a sense, is like the shadow counterpart to Andy Dufresne. Like very clearly, like more in abstraction than any of the other characters in the story. Even taking into account that characters in a myth would be abstract in general. Like Pennywise is basically pretty much a pure idea, like a pure encapsulation of like the shadow of the childhood experience in the way that he takes on like the different fears and insecurities and nightmares of the kids. Uh in contrast, Andy Dufresne becomes, I guess, the dream of the prisoners. Like he's everything they could possibly want from a fellow inmate in a positive sense. Um, and in a sense, Buddy is like everything that the people he redeems could want in their life. And then, of course, he does like fulfill the natural end of the prodigal son story when he returns to the North Pole. Um, but I still find it very interesting that, you know, he's not naturally like of the North Pole, and yet in a mythic sense, this is like still his home. He's like an angel. It's like he's leaving heaven and coming down to earth, to take the bodily aspect of humanity unto himself to become whole. And yeah, that's basically about ah about it for what I've been thinking about Elf compared with Stephen King's work. Just some thoughts. Hope you guys found it interesting, I guess. Thanks for listening to my rambling. Feel free to like and subscribe, and have a good night.